Hey everybody, it's John from Seattle Coffee Gear. We're here in the commercial kitchen today doing a little bit of a different video. Not quite a crew review, not quite a crew comparison, but we're going to talk about the difference between a dual boiler and a heat exchanger. Here with me today I have the Rocket Espresso Boxer Timer and I have the RE Dopia. These do represent a good amount of the espresso machine market out there in their designs. So they're going to be good kind of test subjects for what we're going to be talking about today. Why don't we go ahead and jump in then? So this machine here, Dopia, usually means something like two. So dual boiler, two boilers inside of it. And then the Boxer uses a heat exchanger. The Boxer does have a copper boiler and this uses stainless steel boilers. Some dual boilers might have copper boilers, but most of them are using stainless steel, and most heat exchangers are going to be copper. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it's usually how it works. Both of these machines function pretty similarly. You have your two steam wands, two groups, your volumetric buttons. This one just has the buttons on top here and the steam wands on the side. The main difference between these two machines is how they heat water for brewing coffee. All commercial espresso machines are doing two things essentially. They are heating water for steam so you can froth milk and produce hot water, and then they are heating water to brew coffee or pull a shot of espresso. And those have to be at two different temperatures. Your steam boiler is at about 250 degrees and you want your espresso to be brewing around 200 degrees depending on the coffee you're using. So these use different methods to heat water for that brewing temperature. They're both heating water in a similar way for steam. The steam boiler on these is pretty similar aside from the materials that they're made out of, but it's how they're heating water for brewing that differs between the two of these. The design of the heat exchanger is a little bit older than the design of the dual boiler. The heat exchanger is what has been used for the past 100 or so years, whereas the dual boiler didn't come into prominence until La Marzocco started making that in the 70s, around there. I'm a little fuzzy on my history of that, so I'm sure one of you can correct me in the comments down below. But the heat exchanger design uses one massive boiler, and a simplified version of it is it has little tubes running through it. As water passes through those two little tubes, it is heated up to the proper temperature for brewing coffee. If you're using the machine consistently and pulling shots and constantly pulling water through those heat exchanger tubes, you're going to have a pretty consistent temperature, but as you can probably start to understand, that temperature can vary because as the water passes through it, if it's passing through more slowly or if it's passing through more quickly, that's changing the amount of time that the water is spending in that heat exchanger. And so that is changing the temperature that the water is going to get to when it's brewing the coffee. That's the main or a simple explanation of what a heat exchanger does. We'll look inside these machines in a bit to get a better visual representation of that. The dual boiler, on the other hand, has that one boiler for steam, and then it has a separate boiler for brewing. That boiler for brewing, instead of kind of heating up water as you need it or on the fly, it always has water at a pretty consistent, stable temperature. If I was to run both my groups a bunch, that could cause some temperature changes, because as I'm pulling water out of these groups, that boiler has to fill. And on most espresso machines, it's just filling with cold water. So that's dropping the temperature of that boiler. If I pull a shot and wait, and it fills a little bit and heats that, pull a shot, wait, fills a little bit and heats it, that's how I get good temperature stability. So in a coffee shop environment, both of these are going to have some pretty consistent temperatures, but the dual boiler design is going to have more consistent temperatures. You can make really good coffee on each, but it's going to be a little bit easier to do it more consistently on this dual boiler than it will be on this heat exchanger. The other function or the other thing to consider with these two is because there's less metal in a heat exchanger, generally those cost less than a dual boiler would. The dual boiler has two separate boilers instead of just that one boiler. So that's more metal, more heating elements. So it's going to cost more for a dual boiler than it would for a heat exchanger. Now that we've talked about a lot of those differences, let's take the top off each of these, look inside, and then we can get an even better idea of what the difference between the two styles is. We're looking at the inside of the Boxer right now. So this is the heat exchanger that we're looking at. There's just this big metal boiler in here. This one is coated, so it's actually a copper boiler, even though it might look at first glance like it's stainless. So this is copper. If you look at these two things right here, these are your heat exchangers. So the angle that these are running make me think that these are running kind of through the boiler like that, and the water's heating up as it's passing through that. This machine looks a little bit different than some, because if you look up here, you have two separate tubes up here. Part of the reason for that, I'm not sure exactly which one is which, because I'm not the technical guy necessarily, but one of those is a thermosiphon on this machine. So it's always passing some water through the group so that the group stays hot, so that when water gets up there to brew, it's just focusing on brewing the coffee. That way it's not focusing on heating up that group and brewing coffee. So that's gonna help stabilize that temperature a little bit more than it might have been in the old days where it was just hot water running to this and it only stayed hot because of that. Back here is the pressure stat, and that's controlling the temperature of that boiler. That's kind of secondary, not important to what we're talking about right now. But the main thing to see is this is a single boiler, and these are the heat exchangers running through it, and water is heating up as it goes through there and gets to the group. So works well, been working for the past 100 years and making pretty good coffee that way, but it does take a little bit more skill to manage the temperature on a machine like this. I'm going to put this back together and we will go and look at the RE-Doppia. We are now looking at the inside of the RE-Doppia. So this is the dual boiler machine, and as you can see from a first glance here, there's a lot more going on this machine than there was on the Boxer. So similar to the Boxer in one way, that we have this boiler right here, which is our steam boiler, and then we have a separate boiler in front here, and that is our brew boiler. So these are at two different temperatures. This is one that's at about 250 degrees. This one is about 200 degrees. You can also see that this has these little blocks right here that are running forward, and those are connected to the groups where we're pulling espresso, and that has water inside of it at the same temperature as the boiler, so then this all stays the same temperature. So the thermosiphon that was on the Boxer, that was using the thermosiphon to keep the groups warm. That's what these are doing right here. They're keeping the groups warm, so it's all at the same temperature. That's pretty much the biggest difference between these two here, is just the way that they heat this brewing water for brewing espresso, but this just does it in a way that makes it a little bit more consistent and a little easier to use. Now let's talk about the difference in practicality and make some shots on the Boxer and then on this machine here. We are back, got the tops back on each of these after our little tour of the internals of these machines. Let's now talk about practically the difference between these two machines as you're pulling a shot kind of in the life of a coffee shop. Let's start out with the Doppia here. So usually when you pull a shot of espresso, most of us, if you've gone through any sort of formal training, you're trained to purge your group for a couple seconds before you pull your shot, to like bring fresh water up to the group. That, I believe, is rooted in the heat exchanger and people learning how to make coffee on heat exchangers, and we'll talk about that in a second there. But if you look at this water is at a great temperature. It's not crackling. You can see something like that steam coming off of it. I don't have a way to measure this right now, at least accurately, but you'll see the difference pretty quick once we jump to the Boxer here. So the Boxer, with its heat exchanger design, is going to work a little bit differently. So the water has been sitting inside those heat exchanger tubes, which are surrounded by that 250 degree water and steam mixture that's in the boiler there. So the water that's going to be coming out of here is going to be at that 250 degree mark because it's been sitting in there for so long. So when I turn that on, we hear that crackling noise until I'm able to purge all that water out of the group. And once I hear that stop, now I know that I'm back down to the right temperature range. So that might be a step in your coffee quality just by doing that, just by knowing that, that you need to purge that if the machine's been sitting for a while. That's common across all heat exchanger machines because they all share that same design. Now, some of you are probably freaking out at this point, wondering if you've been making terrible coffee for your whole barista career. But odds are, if you're using a machine like this in a coffee shop and you're pulling shot after shot after shot, the natural rhythm and progression of that is going to keep your temperature in a good range for pulling shots of espresso. It's only if the machine has been sitting for a long time or if you're running water through it for a long time that you're going to run into issues. That being said, a dual boiler machine is going to have an easier time making really good coffee and doing that repeatably. And it's also going to be easier for a new barista to learn on because it's just one extra variable that they don't really have to think about. On this machine, you're having to think about where your water temperature is, how you can drop that if you have to wait. Whereas on this machine, you're pretty much just pulling shots and running with that. So you don't have as much to worry about. That was the differences between a dual boiler and a heat exchanger in design, in function, how they look. I hope this was an interesting video for you guys. You learned a little bit about how espresso machines work. Maybe this influenced your decision on what espresso machine to buy. Again, nothing wrong with the heat exchanger design. It's been around forever. It is bulletproof. If you're in a restaurant or something like that where you know maintenance is going to be a little bit more difficult, usually recommend a heat exchanger because they're less expensive to maintain. They last usually a little bit longer than something like a dual boiler will, just because you're only worried about that one heating element, a little bit simpler inside of them, just as you saw looking between those two. But if you're serious about your coffee program and you want to make it easy for your baristas to make really, really good coffee, it does make sense to spend a little bit more and go with something that is a dual boiler or has some sort of better temperature management than a heat exchanger does. If you guys have any questions or you feel like I didn't cover something well or didn't talk about something in this video, please leave us a comment down below. We love the feedback. Or if you just like the video, I like that feedback too. Encourages us, lets us know that we're doing a good job. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this for home or commercial like we're doing here now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day.